Arguably the first romantic critic, Longinus has a very interesting discussion on the issue of sublimity. In fact, he can be said to be the origin of the entire concept of sublimity, which became so much important with this continental philosopher Immanuel Kant in the 18th century. And when we talk about classical criticism, often these three figures are the most important: Plato, Aristotle, and Longinus. Longinus was possibly a Roman critic of the 2nd century AD, according to some 4th century AD, but actually that is not very important for our purpose. We are dealing with literary criticism, not history as such. So that maybe kept in abeyance for the time being. So though he has been said to be the first romantic critic, he starts or rather discusses the thing very methodically, like like a technical person, which generally is not associated with the concept of romanticism. He starts his essay or treatise on the Sublime by saying that two things are very important for any technical treatise. The first is to define the subject, and the second is to point out the methodologies of attaining that subject or target. So he first defines his subject, that is sublime, and secondly tells us what are the means by which we can attain sublimity. So what is sublime? So he says, I quote, "The sublime, wherever it occurs, consists in a certain loftiness and excellence of language, and that it is by this, and this only, that the greatest poets and prose writers have gained eminence and won themselves a lasting place in the temple of fame. A lofty passage does not convince the reason of the reader, but takes him out of himself." Unquote. So, it is clear that it is a certain lofty, that is elevated language. Of course, he will make it clear later that lofty language is not enough. The thought also should be lofty, because only lofty thought can give you something like a permanent sublimity. Language may be simple also, but initially he starts with it because whatever is available has to be made available in language. Like there is nothing outside the text. So he starts with this linguistic definition or principle. And then the second point in the definition, if you have noticed, he differentiates it from rational arguments or convincing rather. What appeals to our thought or our reason can convince us, and then by the same token we may choose not to be convinced. But sublime is such a thing that it is, according to Longinus, it is not in the power of the reader or the listener to choose to be influenced. He cannot choose whether he will be influenced or not. It influences him automatically. I hope you remember the tale or influence of the Ancient Mariner in Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. That is, the listener or the wedding guest cannot choose but hear, and thus spoke on the ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. That concept must have come from Longinus's idea of the sublime. I can give another example, slightly anachronistic in a way, but it serves the purpose. William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. After the murder of Caesar, both the supporters of the murder and the opponents of the murder give their speech, represented by Brutus and Mark Antony respectively. Brutus gives a very CEOT, curt speech, and he convinces the reason of the Roman people available were there. But after that, when Mark Antony's turn comes, who was a friend and loyal friend of Caesar, he gives such a moving speech that the people who were attending that funeral were roused to a vindictive violence against the conspirator, and then they finally killed each and every one of the conspirator. So that is the power of the sublime, though murder is not something sublime. But just to explain this, I mean, what Longinus could have meant by this, in case of sublime, the power to be influenced not being within one's own reach. I have just used these two examples, the rhyme of the ancient mariner and that of Mark Antony's speech in Julius Caesar. Hope it will help you understand this better. Now, while discussing the means to achieve sublimity, he again, you know, does things in the manner of a very good medical practitioner, even of contemporary times. If you go to a medical practitioner, good medical practitioner, to know the ways and means to improve your health, generally they do two things. Those who are not so good, they do only one thing, prescribe certain things to be taken and eaten, etc. But those who are comprehensive, they will tell you, I mean, both what is to be done and also what is or what are not to be done to attain good health. Similarly, our Longinus first tells us about things to be avoided in order to achieve sublimity, and then he tells us what are the things that are to be included to achieve sublimity. That is his complete package in this. So he says, first thing that has to be avoided in order to achieve sublimity is the use of bombastic word, a high-flown language. He says, bombast is one of the hardest things to avoid in writing. For all those writers who are ambitious of a lofty style, through dread of being convicted of feebleness and poverty of language, slide by a natural gradation into the opposite extreme. Most writers, especially the new writers, they think that they must impress. It continues till date. They must impress people by showing their knowledge or their innovativeness, and they express it more in their language than in their plot, etc. So finally, what comes is a very stilted structure. This was the bad structure of, say, neoclassical style, except like Pope, Dryden, or Johnson, who were, though they were in favor of the high flown style, but then they also made things communicable. Otherwise, in general, and this is an important problem in places like India, where till date many of us believe that good English means, though Longinus did not speak about English as such, but we believe that good English or good language means use of bombastic words. And then we present a very ornate structure of things even in our day-to-day speeches, which finally appear ridiculous. I mean, to those who know the real language or the real business of the language. Then another thing is called puerility. That is most ignoble of all vices. By puerility, we mean a pedantic habit of the mind which by over-elaboration ends in frigidity. It is in certain ways opposite to the bombastic. That is, you make things accessible. You try to make things too accessible. You are under the impression that your reader or listener may not understand something you are saying. So you go on explaining this is this, this is this, this is this. So finally it ends in frigidity. And then the third point he says is third sort of vice, that is false sentiment, showing emotions or extra emotions or false emotions when none is required, or showing inadequate emotion when more would have been required. The first type is, since film studies and film criticism are very important these days, the first thing is very common in the Bollywood movies. Crying, shrieking, and then nahi, that kind of thing when someone dies. So these are the third kind of vices which do not lead to sublimity. Not only in Bollywood films, I remember Alexander Pope's criticism of the 18th century fashionable ladies in The Rape of the Lock. No louder cries to pitying heavens are cast when husbands or when lapdogs breathe their lust. Anyway, so he was talking about society, so that kind of false emotion also should be avoided. Now, having said all these things, he finally goes on to tell us what constitutes the sublime. So, here it is so simple that it is best to hear in his own word, I shall now proceed to enumerate the 5 principal sources. So, sources are important from which almost all sublimity is derived. Assuming, of course, the preliminary gift on which all the prescribed 5 sources depend, namely the command of language. So, language, as I said earlier, is the first principle. I mean, since I am addressing my direct students basically, so often you ask about materials, these and that. You use all this, but then there is problem with the very basic structure of English. So then everything falls flat. But if you write correct English, even if in simple subject verb object structure, but there is no mistake, then it works like magic in most cases. So that is why he says that command of language is must. So that is why I am not elaborating on it. But then there are 5 other sources. But the first and the most important is grandeur of thought. As I said in the beginning, when he was telling us about loftiness of language, actually he meant loftiness of thought. Because without the thought being lofty, only the language being lofty will not serve any purpose. It will become a mock epic or mock heroic kind of thing. So in section 8 of this treatise called On the Sublime, he makes it very clear that the most important thing is grandeur of thought. Unless as a writer you have great thoughts, you cannot produce great thoughts in writing, and the question of sublimity will not appear, because sublimity is, after all, nothing but good phrasing of lofty thoughts. Now you see, it is quite comparable to Aristotle's emphasis on the plot. So as Aristotle said in Poetics that plot, as it were, is the soul of tragedy, characters come only second. So here, in a way, the soul of sublimity is grandeur of thought. And, or otherwise we may say, command of language is the soul, because that is taken for granted otherwise anyway. But then the most important of the 5 sources that he enumerates, having taken for granted the command of language, so out of the 5 sources, the most important is grandeur of thought. Second is a vigorous and spirited treatment of passions. So please relate it to the third point, that has to be avoided for achieving sublimity. So this is the positive part of, or positive version of that thing only, wrong or false treatment of passion or false representation of emotion. So here, what is to be done is a strong and spirited treatment of the passions. And these two, he says, are basically innate, or in today's language you can say genetic. They have to be there inside us. These two conditions of sublimity, this is a quote, depend mainly on natural endowments, whereas those which follow derive assistance from art. So art and nature, the age-old kind of debate or dichotomy. The third is a certain artifice in the employment of figures, which are of 2 kinds, figures of thought and figures of speech. The fourth is dignified expression, which is subdivided into A, proper choice of words, and B, the use of metaphors and other ornaments of diction. Actually, there is a lot of correspondence between the third and the fourth. We can summarize this as dignified expression only, or use of poetic language. The fifth cause of sublimity, which embraces all these things, is majesty and elevation of structure. It is structure as a whole. So the last 3, that is use of figures of speech, use of dignified expression, and using an elevated structure, these are more or less structural principles of composition in sublimity. But as we have said, these are secondary. If there is grandeur of thought and expressed in a lofty language, which is again not too lofty, then you have that magic of sublimity. Let us take the example of this statement from the first book of the Bible, that is the Genesis, from the King James Version. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So this is perfect example of sublimity. I mean, irrespective of the fact whether you believe in God or not. I mean, it is the perfect statement given by a believer in the simplest of languages, which appears just as magical, or let us say sublime. You cannot make it simpler. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Can you? You cannot. So the barest minimum of language is expressed to to express what was one of the most important things in the entire creation, that is the creation of light, or the beginning of creation itself. So these in brief are the basic points of Sublime, and to this I would like to add another thing from Longinus only, not my own. He has given this in section 7, just the section preceding the section which deals with the 5 principal sources, that is, how to know whether a thing is truly sublime or not finally. The test, according to him, is repeated reading or repeated hearing of that text or the portion of the text. Actually, to make things clear, which should have been said earlier, but since he did not say, I also did not say, he does not mean that entire work line by line has to be sublime. There will be some passages, some parts, some lines in a work which will have a lasting effect on your memory, on the reader's or listener's memory, and they enlighten the entire book or the entire work like lightning. He uses that example of lightning. We can have better examples today because lightning just illuminates things for a flash of a second, but anyway, it was his example. So please remember, he does not mean entire work has to be sublime, but there will be some passages, lines, utterances, etc. Anyway, but then he says that these will be truly sublime only when you find the effect of sublimity in them even after repeated reading. Effect of sublimity is you get carried away into a different world without your choosing to be carried away. Otherwise, he says this is not sublime. So I quote, "If then any work, on being repeatedly submitted to the judgment of an acute and cultivated critic, fails to dispose his mind to lofty ideas, if the thoughts which it suggests do not extend beyond what is actually expressed, and if the longer you read it, the less you think of it, there can be here no true sublimity." So not only it has to elevate one or transport one, but has to elevate one or transport one repeatedly. And then of course there is another thing here, it must indicate something beyond what is stated. And at some point of time, as he gives the example of Odyssey, silence of Ajax in Odyssey, even silence can work as sublime. In certain conditions, nothing can be said or should be said. In dramatic situation or day-to-day situation in life, some people become silent. There are some kind of people who are usually always silent. Either they're saints or they're opportunists. That is a different thing. But there are some people who often speak, who are wise, but then in some situation they chose not to speak when they're hurt a lot, for example. So that silence becomes, if you represent in writing in that part, that adds to the sublimity. So I think I have covered all the important points related to the concept of the sublime so far as Longinus is concerned. Now you have to study the text if you want to go deeper, and then of course you should go deeper. I am addressing my direct students especially. So please read all the theoretical texts, as and when you get time, read them repeatedly, because these are the pillars on which our judgment or critique of judgment, as Kant said, depend. Thank you.